Thank you again so much, everyone, for joining us. This is the first in a series of peer learning exchanges that the Seattle Equitable Development Initiative is going to be hosting. And so we thank our guests, our special guests who are joining us today for meeting us and for sharing with us today all the things that all the knowledge they can give us we want to take in. My name is Mishelle Oon, and I am the Real Estate Development and Program Implementation Manager here at EDI. And I'm here with our Funding and Community Investment Manager, Giulia Pasciuto. She's going to be in conversation with our special guest today, who I'll introduce shortly, Jessica Ramirez, who's also here with EDI, who works across several initiatives in our program. She'll be managing the chat and posting useful information and links as we go along. And feel free to post comments and questions in the chat. We will have a Q&A time at the end as well. And so just before we get into it, a quick intro to Seattle Equitable Development Initiative and why we're hosting these conversations. EDI was started in 2017, utilizing some city funds for a handful of demonstration projects across areas of Seattle that have been affected by displacement, including the Chinatown International District, Othello, Rainier Beach, and the Central District. And then since that time, since 2017, we've grown and evolved, and we have awarded $140 million in city funding to 77 grantees at this point with our small, scrappy team. And now we also award on an annual basis an additional $20 million or so, all to community-owned and community-serving organizations that are completing property acquisition and real estate development projects here in Seattle. And this might sound relatable to some of you, but EDI has somewhat been building the plane as it's been flying. Sure, some of you can relate to that old saying, but right now we're preparing to launch into strategic planning, and for the first time to really in earnest reflect on the identity of the program, the role of the program, and shift from working from a more reactionary place into a more proactive and purposeful place as a program. And so that's why we're here today. We want to open up this dialogue and gain insights and learn from other funders and other stakeholders in this space. And while we may each serve a different role and work in different regions of the country, we all have the shared goals of supporting the successful development of community organizations and facilities. And so, as I mentioned, Giulia is here. She's our Funding and Community Investment Manager. She's been here from the get-go with EDI, really driving our efforts to shape and improve the EDI program. And then joining us from Chicago area is Kate Ansorga, and she is the Vice President of Real Estate Solutions for the Illinois Facilities Fund, or IFF. And Kate and her team of 12 plan and execute community development projects across Chicago metro area for nonprofits in the communities they serve. And Kate and her team at IFF deliver technical assistance with an emphasis on real estate and capital readiness. And that is why we are so excited to hear from her today. And then also joining us from the Bay Area is Saul Etlin, who is a senior advisor to the president at Community Vision. And Community Vision is a community development financial institute, CDFI. Based in California. And Saul has over 20 years of experience managing and guiding nonprofits. And during his time at Community Vision, he's worked with dozens of organizations on sustainable real estate solutions with an emphasis on organizational readiness, and has developed programming to support community-owned and controlled real estate entities. And that is why we're so excited to have Saul today. So with that, let me stop. I'll pass over to Giulia so we can get into the reason why we're all here and start this conversation.
Thanks, Mishelle. As Mishelle said, we're really excited to be starting this conversation talking about real estate readiness and organizational readiness for project. It's an issue that comes up a lot for EDI. We were created to help fill a gap between what private lenders and CDFIs were willing to fund and what government agencies were willing to fund in the Seattle area, with a recognition that taking on real estate development projects, it's an expertise that has long been gatekept, I think, or we have to make it more complicated than it needs to be, but also realizing that there are skills, there's knowledge to be learned, and figuring out how as a program we can help build up that knowledge, that shared knowledge, open the gate to bring in more folks to this table. And so we fund community-based organizations with $75,000 on an annual basis to support organizational readiness, which could look like strengthening your board, building up your fundraising capacity, but also project support. So hiring technical consultants, people with the specific expertise that you don't necessarily want to have long-term on staff to bring on your project. We've received a lot of feedback over the last handful of years, both appreciating us for the flexibility of our funds, but also reflecting that sometimes our grantees don't even know where to start. It's like we want to take on this project, but we don't know what's the most meaningful place to put that first 75,000 or put that first 150,000 into the project and into the organization. And so we are really excited to talk to you all because you've been thinking about this longer than we have, and have really focused your energy and resources around that organizational and project readiness. And so I'm wondering if you can both share what your role has been in building the capacity of community-based organizations. And I think maybe we'll start with Kate. I know you have a couple of slides.
Thank you, Julia. Thanks. I just want to thank you for the opportunity to speak about this. It's really exciting to see people doing this work throughout the country and hear how they're approaching it. And I love conversations about readiness and capacity building. Those are some of the things that I think are most interesting and exciting. So I, as said, I'm at IFF. IFF is a nonprofit that works with nonprofits at the intersection of facilities and financing. So what does that mean? So our work is really focused on the nonprofits who are trying to understand how they use facilities, how that aligns with their mission, and how it's financially sustainable. So I came to this work working with nonprofits and doing real estate consulting to help with project management. And through that work, we found, a lot of people needed to be real estate, have the capital and have the organizational capacity in order to engage on the real estate project. And sometimes we are running into situations where organizations didn't have the other pieces of capacity. And so we were challenged with finding the capital and finding the organization capacity to do that. So we started to think about what would it mean for IFF, an organization that is a lender to nonprofits, an organization that is a real estate to nonprofits, to think intentionally about how we work with organizations to build their capacity. With that, I'm going to share some slides here. So when we think about capacity, we've been approaching this in terms of like three kinds of readiness. I think there's capital and readiness, and a lot of people might understand this directly just thinking about what does a project cost to build, and does an organization have funding to build the project or have a path towards funding? The second is real estate readiness, and we think about, does an organization have land to build on or a building to renovate? Do they have an architect in place? Do they have someone who's helping with construction? And then getting into some details about environmental condition of a site, due diligence, their understanding of it, zoning, those types of approvals. So that's real estate readiness. The last piece is organizational readiness, which I sometimes think is harder to grasp, but it's really thinking about the capacity of an organization. Do they have paid staff who are working on this? Do those staff have time and ability to commit to a project? Do they have a board who's supporting them? Have they been working with community and have community to support behind it? And I think it's helpful to think about these independently, because when we think about capacity building, a lot of times you might say like a project's not ready. But when we're not specific and precise, then we can't think about what would it mean to get an organization ready. And so when we start to break it down a little bit more detailed, then we can start to think about how we could build capacity in one of these three areas more intentionally to get a project ready to happen. When we are working in capacity building, we're working to try and bring different solutions in order to support both the community, philanthropy and government who are supporting this, and the community projects themselves. We think about, what is the cohort of projects that are being supported? So a lot of times it's a specific intervention with one project to help them think about success. But when we look across a cohort of projects, we start to notice that there are themes coming up, and that what one organization's encountering is actually happening on 3, 4, 5 projects. And when we think about making that umbrella bigger of like, what if we were trying to solve something for 4 or 5 projects, we might be able to bring more people to the table to be problem solvers and be starting to think about, do we need to navigate just this through one time, or do we actually need to start to think about system change in ways that we could change how people move through our systems, through permitting systems, through zoning, through capital award processes. So we support organizations by doing one-on-one coaching, but also system navigation. Like, what does it mean to get a loan from an organization? What does it mean to apply to a city government to get a grant? How do people think about aligning the timing of their grants with the construction of their projects? And then it may mean doing some project-specific technical assistance, like helping someone through zoning, helping someone get a cost estimate, understand the condition of those. But those are very project-specific. And last but not least, I think it's really important to do peer learning. It's challenging and tiring to do community development. And for organizations who are doing this and encounter a lot of roadblocks, it's really powerful to see peers, hear from those peers, hear that they're having a hard time too, but also hear their successes and see if those successes could be something that could motivate that organization. Oh, one of the examples of how we're doing this work is through equitable transit-oriented development. So Chicago started Elevated Chicago around 2016 out of work that was under SPARK, which is Resilient Communities, and working to identify targeted train stations in Chicago to build a pipeline of real estate projects. This was really responding to some policy changes in the city where we were seeing more density and development on the north side in higher income neighborhoods and not seeing corresponding developments on south and west sides communities. And so we thought, what would it look like to think intentionally about trying to build capacity in south and west side neighborhoods so that they could see higher density developments aligned with our transit infrastructure. This has led to the city committing ARPA funds to $10 million to award grants to 29 projects. And that was paired with a technical assistance program. And so we were meeting with all 29 of those projects to understand what their goals were, what their timeline was, what their capital gaps, and what real estate challenges. On the right side, we have a map of an example of a project that received technical assistance multiple times. They got zoning support because they wanted to do a project without parking. And so they had to go through an administrative adjustment process to get that approved. They got coaching on the real estate to understand some scope that was missing from the development budget. And then they worked with an attorney to help them understand incentives that could support the project, and eventually led to some communications and storytelling support with them at the grand opening. And so when we think about these individually, what does it mean to support those projects? In aggregate, you start to see really powerful outcomes. We see this work as being bidirectional. We're both helping individual projects, but I think it's also really important to capture that these themes are getting elevated up to the government as we think about how the processes work, but also to funding and whether the money's coming at the right time and the right amounts for what projects need. So 2 examples, I mentioned the one on that slide before, is a childcare center that we worked with that was missing a lot of costs in the budget. And this is what we see in the real estate side, is a lot of times people have very rosy outlooks about what things are going to cost, and they might be missing a lot of soft costs and financing fees, furniture, fixtures, and equipment, and those kinds of things. So they underestimate how much capital they need. They start moving, and then they eventually realize that there's capital gaps. And we work to try and help people understand what their total development costs are earlier so that they're really asking for the right amount of capital and then can move more quickly through the real estate process. We are also working to bring in money during the pre-development time because they had to pay the architect and pay other staff during the pre-dev phase, and they didn't have cash on hand. So when we see these smaller organizations, they don't have cash in the bank to be able to pay that, and they get reimbursed at construction. And then we also help this organization, so this is around transit-oriented development, really think about parking. And so in this case, they were eligible for reduction in parking. And so that both saved costs on construction, but it also helped them move through the permitting process faster. Another project was a community center and coffee shop. And the city grant process is really challenging. It's time consuming. You have to move through one gate and the next gate and the next gate. A lot of organizations don't prepare for how long it's going to take and how much time the process will take. So we provided coaching, and then we're able to get on the phone with the city to talk through some of the grant requirements to help this organization get all the paperwork in. We also supported them with pay applications. And I think the quote on the bottom right, when we were doing an impact study to look at the impact of this program, I love it. It says, the hardest part for me was whenever I felt like I had to justify to people that this was a good idea. Being part of Elevated Works has been invaluable because talk about not having to convince people, they got it right from the start. So the powerful piece is that they get on the phone with someone who's already convinced that this is a good idea and is helping them navigate the process instead of having to convince one more person that this will be impactful for their community. Thanks for letting me share.
Thank you so much, Kate. I'm already starting to make notes of some themes, but I'm going to pass it over to Saul. Share a little bit about the role that community visions plays and how do you define readiness?
Yeah, that's great. So just for folks on the call too, for people who are newer to CDFIs, like Community Vision and IFF, we're sort of outliers in the space. Most of you probably know CDFIs as small business lenders. We are both specifically community facilities lenders. The vast majority of our clients are nonprofit organizations looking to build space. So just a little context, if you're like new to CDFIs, are like, ooh, I didn't know about these CDFIs. They're very interesting. But if you go out there, you're going to meet a lot of different kinds of CDFIs, just for some context. And in the network of CDFIs, there's not a lot of us, right? You do have Craft 3 in your market, and they do community facilities lending. They actually are interesting because they work across the spectrum. So Community Vision, so we're both a lender, and then we have a real estate advising practice. We've been doing it for about 20 years, working with Bay Area and Central Valley, primarily nonprofits, to kind of go on a real estate journey. Where we're similar to IFF. We use a lot of the same language, real estate readiness. We actually also have like fiscal fitness. We tend to work a little bit earlier in the real estate development process, and like mostly around organizational development to get ready for a project. And so we have 3 buckets for ourselves, which is financial readiness, organizational readiness, and then the elements, the real estate readiness, setting up the questions for the project. We're really trying to get to board and staff agreement around doing a project at all. We are walking alongside organizations as they explore their organizational finances to see if they can take on a project, and not just to do the acquisition, but to own and operate a building, which is just as important as getting through the construction project. For the folks here who know nonprofits, a lot of them end up with a big deferred maintenance and having not having capital reserves. So we really want trying to pay attention to the whole picture about like, okay, we're going to own a building now. What does this mean, right? We also do a lot of leasing support as well. So thinking about what the financial situation of the organization is, getting to board staff agreement, and in the agreement process, part of that is like, how is this work going to happen inside the organization? We don't want executive directors to become accidental developers. This happens a lot, where the ED thinks that they can need to run a project, and what we really trying to get them to focus on some very specific parts of the project. Raise the money, do the design, get ready for ownership. That's really key for us. There's some other stuff, but then they're going to partner. It could be an IFF. They actually have more in-house services that they can provide around project management. For us in our market, we tend to go out as part of our work to assemble a development team later on. Community Vision doesn't do what IFF does. Big piece for us is really working with folks to do a visioning process and really be clear about why they want to own a building, how does it match and fit with and amplify their vision, and like what's going to be different for communities because this real estate asset is community owned, right? Being as a nonprofit. So what we're really trying to do is set that table to get folks really clear that they're going to do this project. It's going to take a lot of time and energy, and get all the pieces in order so that they can talk to all the folks that Kate has talked about. When you have an architect and an engineer and you're going to move into having a project manager, that team doesn't have to answer a bunch of these early stage questions about organizational readiness. We are also hoping that through the visioning process and the case making, we are not fundraisers ourselves, but we do help folks think about a capitalization strategy. And whether you're going to borrow or raise money or use new market tax credit transaction, you need a bold vision for your project that attracts dollars to the table. We do some smaller stuff about like just space planning. How much space do you need? A lot of folks come into the project and they're just like, well, we know we want a building, but we're not quite sure how big it is, right? And so we take folks through that process so that our architects might fine tune it with them later. But to us, those are all of the elements of readiness: financial management, financial readiness, organizational readiness, and then real estate readiness, to build that whole package so that they can go out and get a team, raise the money, and move forward with the project.
Thanks, Saul. Mishelle, were you going to jump in? I have a question.
You go first. I'll save my question for later, but I have a burning question that I want answers to, but I will wait.
No, go for it. Go for it. This is the point.
Okay. And I think you both have touched on this a little bit, but can you tell us a little bit more about how an organization comes to be either a client of yours, or is that where you were going, Giulia, too? Like, how do they get into the mix? What are you looking for? Is like we fund through an RFP process, for example, an annual RFP process. So what's the process? Maybe Kate, could we start with you on that one?
There's, one of the ways we've been working to provide capacity building support is really thinking about where there's a shared priority with funding through often philanthropy, government, and community who have identified needs, so that our work is supporting organizations who are already identified how they want to respond to community with facilities. Saul's alluding to like, how much space do you need? Right. And so a lot of times we'll start with an organization. It's like, how do you use space today? How would you like to use it? And why is that important from a mission perspective, right? As we think about real estate in our community and how they're assets, like what is it that those spaces are doing for community? How do they make impact? And then what's the business model to how they do that? Is there funding to support that program? And then we're going to think about the real estate. So we can do this one by one. So IFF does real estate consulting for an organization that walks in and is like, I have a facility challenge. But we're also starting to think about like, where in the ecosystem are other people trying to do that intentionally, where they're actually designing capital to be either readiness project capital, like ideation and activation money, or into the line construction capital. And how do we start working in partnership with government and philanthropy when they put that money out, so that the technical assistance is provided side by side with the capital funding? We find that this is more impactful when the funder and philanthropy and government are partnering with the technical assistance. If we wait for projects to encounter challenge and then offer technical assistance, it's really hard. So the developers have encountered a bunch of challenges, and then suddenly another person's being thrown at them, and they're told, here, use this resource in order to navigate forward. And at that point, they've already exhausted so much energy that they don't really want to talk to one more person. But when we offer this at the beginning and say, we know that the challenge is really hard. We know that community development is hard. We know that it's risky. And we're going to have someone who's going to help and coach you along the way. We're able to build a relationship with someone before it gets hard and hopefully mitigate those challenges and prevent them from happening, or at least be there when it does happen so that they have strategies to be able to navigate through it. That's more impactful, I think, than trying to assume that someone's going to find you one by one.
So I would say like the bulk of our, well, first off, like we serve about 80 nonprofits a year through our work. Folks come to us a lot of different ways. We're primarily funded by philanthropy to be able to do the work. So we're able to offer our technical assistance program for free, which is great. We do some like fee for service work from time to time. Part of that is it allows us to work with, as a CDFI that is built to move capital and knowledge into low-income communities and communities of color and disinvested and underinvested communities. That's really the priority organizations that we're working with. I don't know, Kate, maybe this is not totally true, but like as a general, I think we work with smaller organizations than maybe IFS. Not that IFS doesn't work with small organizations, but we work with like organizations anywhere like under $3 million all the way down to maybe half very small organizations. Part of our goal is to take them on this journey too, to make sure, like, even if they don't do a real estate project, they still know a great more about their organization than they did when they started. And they'll come to us either directly or by referral, sometimes philanthropy. Like sometimes when we work with philanthropy, they will do a specific thing with us for a set of grantees. But that's gives you a sense of the who and the how. And I would say like we have two big buckets, which are, human service and opportunity organizations, so education, healthcare, that whole gamut, and then art, and then we have a lot of arts and culture organizations that we work with.
Thanks. I have the same question. I was furiously writing down. I appreciate that you asked it, Mishelle. I think we're not going to get to all of our questions, but I'm going to jump forward to what does success look like in this work? And I think in our prep call, we talked a little bit about like, what is an external perception of failure for projects versus like how are we redefining what success means? And so I'm wondering, maybe start with you, Saul. How do you define success, especially for this readiness and capacity building?
I mean, you could kind of see the theme, so maybe my answer's not going to be surprising, but like, yeah, the organization feels confident to take on a project, that they are not taking on more than they can handle, right? That like, we're always trying to like, the irony here as a lender, first off, when we provide real estate TA service, we don't care if you borrow from us or not. We want you to get the cheapest money you can find. We want the project to work, and this is not like a loss leader for us to do the work. But like for us, success is you feel confident about moving forward, that you have a real solid plan, and you know that the organization is going to handle the just the time and effort that's going to go on to take on the project. For us, that's success, right? Like we're as happy as somebody's like, maybe we better put this on the shelf for a few years and come back when we've dealt with some of these other organizational infrastructure questions. And then for those that do move forward, that they just feel like they have a really solid plan, and they know that they're going to have to balance other competing priorities, and they have a plan to like get at the capacity question. For everybody here knows, almost always this lands on the desk of the executive director to be the leader on it. So like, I'm like, look, it could be somebody else in your organization, but like between the capital campaign and leading the project, it frequently is the ED. We really try to set it up too, so that they have a real estate advising committee, getting that. We even have a template board approval that we're going to proceed with the project. So like once there's agreement, that there's no surprises for the ED later on, and be like, where there's some new board member or somebody who's cranky about it comes back and like throws a wrench in the whole works, which has happened and creates a lot of drama. So for us, it's just getting all the pieces in place so that they can, there's going to be plenty of other challenges and questions to ask as they go along with a project manager or a team like IFF or another turnkey developer team. We're trying to get all those as best we can out of the way. So that's really success. Approval to move forward with a really great plan, or come back and do some other work and get ready for a project in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I love this question because I think it often isn't get asked in the time that we're working with an organization. I think it's really powerful. Sometimes I see that like an organization's leadership and a board and the community are not aligned on what success looks like. And example, in Chicago, we have a lot of closed public schools, and a lot of organizations come to us and say, like, my job is to activate the school. I'm a neighborhood organization that is coexisting with this vacant building that's really damaging our community. And that is my mission to do it. And that's what I really push back on them and say, like, why is it your mission? I mean, that's like taking on many of these closed public schools have deteriorated and been vandalized, and could be like a 50,000 square foot building, much substantially larger than what an organization's space needs would show that they need. And, I'm not there to say it's not their mission, but I think it's a really important question for people to ask of, why do you do facility projects? Like, how do you evaluate how you make impact as an organization and what your job is to do in an ecosystem? And so sometimes that work leads to saying that could be a powerful community center for your organization, for the neighborhood, but it may not be your mission to do that. And if it's not your mission, then who could it be? And so we start to think a little bit strategically and a little bit bigger about what success would look like for that neighborhood, because we're really thinking less about that organization's success and more about the community success. So we start thinking about both of those together. We can see that it would be important for that community to be activated, but that it could be financially damaging to that organization if they take that on themselves without partnership with someone else. I think also with grant funding, a lot of times like grant funding is like, here's capital for a project, and sometimes it comes in early, sometimes it comes in late. And so success is like that something gets built, right? And, these projects sometimes take years. A lot can happen in a operating funding for a sector. A lot can happen in a real estate market. And these projects, real estate is risky, right? Like whether it's for profit or nonprofit, it's inherently risky. And so, for an organization to build something, regardless of what happens over those years, could be damaging to that organization. And so, really thinking as we learn new information, as the ecosystem might change, is that organization still set up for success to do this project? And if it isn't, then how do they have an exit ramp that isn't damaging to the community, isn't damaging to that organization? And so in some cases that might mean not building something and thinking about returning grant funding, which is really hard from a reputation for an organization. But if it's done thoughtfully, I think that it can really show that the organization was being strategic and was aligning with its mission and being impactful.
Yeah, and I think, we've had a handful, not many, but a handful of organizations who've come in for capacity building, who are like, we've got this project, our community's been asking us to do it. And then ultimately, after a year of exploration, they're saying, you know what, this isn't right for us right now. And so I just appreciate that, like, we can start socializing a narrative in other funding spaces that's not failure, that's actually a success, because you didn't go down further down the line and buy something and have to figure out how to offload that asset. But Kate, I'm wondering if you could also speak a little bit to the role that IFF plays, thinking about policy and the enabling environment here, and like taking down some of the barriers that the organizations that you work with or that you might fund face as they're taking on their project. How you kind of bulldoze to success that way.
Yeah, I think I used to think of policy as really like the big P of like we're making new laws, and now I'm seeing that there's a lot of really impactful work that is thinking about the processes and how people are impacted by those processes, and that it may not always be writing a new law, that how we push through these processes on projects can be really harmful to those people. And so some of these things are like about the timing of money. So a lot of grants are set up to be completion funded grants. So an organization has to take on a lot of risk and often take on a loan to be able to bridge until they get to construction completion. And for organizations that have cash on hand, that have reserves, they can do this. They can, pull from their reserves to get through construction and then get the grant at completion. But for organizations that don't, they're looking at trying to, establish relationship with a lender and take on additional costs to the project. So they're going to have to pay for construction interest. So it's a borrowing cost for bridging that. That's making that project more expensive. In many cases, they're trying to push through as long as they can without a loan. And so they're using cash on hand that they have for operations to support their real estate project. And so we've started to really look at the timing of money on projects as something that, from a system change, I think is incredibly impactful. Having either the timing of disbursements or having new grants that come in during pre-development phase that support organizations to take risk and push real estate deals forward as being really impactful. In the city, we've also looked at the city's land acquisition process has been very opaque. There's aldermanic privilege in Chicago is known for being very powerful, and that can make it very difficult for organizations who are trying to show that they have capacity to do a real estate project to have success at getting city land. And so we have a lot of vacant lots that haven't been activated because they haven't been successful at getting those properties. And so we started to think about like, how can an organization demonstrate capacity? What's a transparent process that we could apply across more of the processes, and then people would understand what that process is and think about how they could get themselves ready to be successful for that. I think that's another example of like what are like smaller P items. Through the work with Elevated Chicago, and then through another program with Chicago Community Trust called We Rise Together, we've been looking at really identifying common themes across lots of projects. In the city of Chicago, they have a Cut the Tape task force, and they've been working on trying to capture, and so there was about 100 different opportunities for process improvement that were identified about a year ago, and they're working on implementing those in it. So there's been an opportunity to have government, developers, and other people in the ecosystem working together to identify what these challenges are and see how they can be improved. So sometimes this work moves faster, sometimes it moves slower, but I think it's really important to be thinking about these on an aggregate basis. And again, I talked about that bidirectional work, that one of the things that I talk to when I talk to a developer is I say, tell me what your problems are, because if you have to be the one to go to the city every single time, it's really slow going. But if IFF can say, we encountered this 10 times, this is like impactful across a portfolio of 30 projects, 10 out of 30 projects are encountering this. The city, I think, listens differently, and there's an opportunity for system change in a different way. It also makes it more neutral. Instead of that developer having to sound like they're complaining all the time, IFF is, I think, a more neutral party to be able to talk with the city, because we're anonymizing what's happening. And sometimes I see that like newer developers, they'll discount them and say, you know, that's just like one person's experience. Like we don't need to change the system because of one person's experience. And so when we take some of the anonymity of this, we start to see how systems really are changing how our neighborhoods are getting developed.
And I think it reflects back an important question to us as a city agency too. It's like, what's our positionality? And I think one success that I'll just highlight is that because of similar issues, we've been able to implement an equitable development zoning program in the city that allows for flexibility for projects similar to the ones that we fund, specifically looking in single family residential neighborhoods. A lot of our grantees have either owned or purchased single family homes, and allow them to kind of change the zoning with less burden for community serving purposes. And there are other ways I think we've been able to support, but I think we can push ourselves more on that front. I think we have time for one more question. One of the things that you both have mentioned is risk. And I think risk from a funder perspective is very different than risk from an organization perspective. And so I think because you are playing your organizations are playing kind of two roles as a funder, kind of wonder how you distinguish between the funding risk versus the project risk or the organizational risk. And then have you been successful in socializing your capacity building work as a risk mitigation strategy for the funding side?
Yeah, I mean, like, look, I think for us I do think we've done a good job in sharing with funders. So there's like also like grant funding versus lending, right? So like when we were our lending hat, like there are projects that we work on the consulting side that like might not be able to get a loan because you just have to have you have to have the cash flow to be able to repay debt, repay financing. And like we were like from an organizational risk perspective, like we're very concerned about like over leveraged. We just really take very seriously our role in making it clear to organizations about how much debt they can handle or not, right? Because we tend to work with small organizations, and that creates a large fixed asset with a large fixed commitment around repaying debt. From grant perspective, like I think that the biggest thing, and we have been a capital re-grantor, so we've also had to kind of tackle this same kind of question that you are. Like for us, it's all about project readiness. It literally comes down to like, is there a well thought out plan, and who is the team making sure that it happens, right? Has the ED been gone through a project before? And if they haven't, have they hired a project manager? Who is on their real estate advising committee? Really, it becomes ultimately about like, do you know what you're doing? Like, not do you know what you're doing, but like, do you have the team around you that knows what they're doing? And like, are you crystal clear about why you're doing this and what your ultimate goal is, right? So like it comes back to our basis of like financial readiness, organizational readiness, and real estate readiness. That is a risk mitigator for particularly for grants, for grant funding of projects. And then of course we would love to know what the rest of the stack looks like, right? Like do people have their other funding sources kind of lined up? And so I do think like, I don't think everybody sees the work that we do as a risk mitigator, but like with a lot of funders, like at least in the Bay Area, like we have a pretty deep relationship with most of the major capital funders in the Bay Area. Either they fund us or we have given advice to them, and they do see the value of the early stage technical assistance that we provide. So I think it's pretty successful in doing that. And then for others looking at this, if you're making a grant funding, I would stick with like look, this is not new to real estate. Like big lenders would ask the same question. Who's the team? Where are they getting help? What's their stack look like, right? So like these are pretty tried and true. It's just in our space, we tend to have a lot more flexible finance or flexible dollars in because we have grant dollars in a project, and it's not as rigorous. Maybe rigor is not fair, but not needing to get payback changes the conversation.
Yeah, so we do owner's rep services for projects, and that's a huge risk. I think it's generally agreed upon that like having an owner's rep on a project like is supports in a project to have real estate success. so I'm really comfortable talking about risk because like risk, like the sooner and it's easier to talk about it. So I talked about like, there's risk that like costs will go up during the design phase. There's risk that the land price will change. There's risk that like operational funding will change. Like all of these are things that like no one would deny, right? Like those are really common in the real estate risk. I think that sometimes we get into risk around like the capital funding environment. Will someone award this project money or not? Like how do we read the tea leaves to try and understand like if this sector, if this organization is going to be successful at that? And like organizational capacity, right? Like some things that are like out of an ecosystem's control in that space. And those are the risks that are harder because I feel like in the real estate space, those are like more generally like known and accepted. And so what I'm trying to work on in Chicago, I think, is just like talking about all of these kinds of risks more transparently with people. And so we think about like when a project gets money or it doesn't get money, like what's going on with the capacity and readiness and how does that tie to risk? You can mitigate any risk, in my opinion, right? Like there's ways to do it. So you add contingencies, you like bring in a consultant, like you put in a contingency. So there's like, these are common in these deals is that you find ways to mitigate them. And so then we really think about like, what is it that we're worried will go wrong here? Is there a way to mitigate it? Then the entire ecosystem could be thinking about if we want community development projects that look like what we're funding, what would it take for us to think about strategically mitigating those and providing those resources in ways that are identified and known up front instead of waiting for someone to encounter a challenge and then trying to think about like, how do we like get this project through a hurdle with an emergency, like grant funding or emergency strategy. I think these are way easier when we identify what those risks are up front. In terms of like socializing this, I think our work with Elevated Chicago has been going on for years. And I think we're starting to see a lot of people in that collaborative see the value of technical assistance. But it's, I think still slow going. There's limited funds. It costs money from philanthropy or government or someone to be able to offer a proactive technical assistance program that's available kind of at the launch of capital funding. And so when we have other competing, needs in a city, then will this be funded or will we choose something else, right? Like these are real questions that are challenging. And I think that there's some questions about the perceived, like, is this another burden we're adding to a community champion that they have to engage with technical assistance? And so we've really worked to be like, this is coaching and meeting people where they're at and not one more reporting requirement. And so how do you think about like really meeting people where they are, right? And not making this something that they have to like check the box and do. And so that means that we have to really have a lot of knowledge about the community landscape and where people are encountering those challenges so that we're able to be responsive, really understanding the peer projects that are going on. So when that is done well, I don't think it's burdensome, but there are examples where technical assistance is provided and it's up to the developer to state what they need, to go find it, and to make it relevant to their project. And I think that those can be damaging to projects because then people say, well, technical assistance doesn't work. Like, look at all these examples. So when it's done well, I think it's really impactful, but when it's done, it could be burdensome.
We are just dipping our toe into technical assistance. So that's a good note of warning for us. And that'll be a learning curve for us, I'm sure, here. I think we have time for one question from the audience. And I see here from Jose, we've got a really good question around organizational planning. So about succession planning. So I'll just read this off. With regard to readiness and planning, how do you consider an organization's overall succession planning, institutional knowledge, and possible turnover in smaller or emerging nonprofit organizations? And what are some red flags for deeper exploration in an organization before they move forward with a real estate project? Who wants to take that one?
I could start. So like literally in our training materials, like it's like if you're going to go through leadership change, you should not do a real estate project. So like I am not sure how you control for it because likely it's the executive director. In our experience, most of the folks that we work with, I'll tell you, like maybe not vast majority, but a good majority of them are EDs who are nearing the end of their career, who are looking to leave a legacy for their organization. They have gone through all of the machinations of displacement and not having the right kind of space and wanting to leave some level of permanency for their organization. So they're very committed to their project. But to Jose's question, like real tough if you've got a lot of organizational change going on, and like we actually discussed it as part of the org readiness question, not a time to do a project, focus on other stuff, and then let's find another day on this. I will say the other thing we do is we run a couple of leadership development cohorts across California with another CDFI in LA called Genesis LA. There we're watching lots of organizational change, and so we're trying to figure out how to build real estate systems and these are ongoing so they're community land trusts and community development, small community development corporations. That's a different question because they're going to do it on the regular, and we're trying to think about the systems and the infrastructure for organizations to be a real estate concern, right? To do it on the regular, which is slightly different and not as impacted by the change in leadership.
Yeah, so I think permission to pause a project, stop a project, right? Like a lot of times it starts as a pause and then it turns into a stop. And sometimes that's my job, right? At IFF is that I tell someone like, you have permission to pause this project. I know you've invested, and this is like the sunk cost fallacy, right? Like I've invested so much money in an architect designing a project. I own the land, I got it this far, and now what? And it's like, well, let's just play out the scenarios. The one scenario is that you move forward with like a lack of leadership, and then eventually you figure out what you want to do and it changes, and you just spend a lot more money on a plan that you're still not going to build. And so like, it's okay to stop spending more money and pause and think about from a strategic planning perspective, what does your organization need to have leadership in place who can get this project done? So do you have more capital to raise? Do you have more real estate project to get through? And so just sort of like talking through the timeline, what still needs to happen? What decisions does that organization need to take on in order to be successful at getting that? But I can't tell you how many projects I've done with the most charismatic one-person organization, right? Like you meet these people who are just like fearless and committed and passionate and personally like carry this project on their back across the finish line. And then I worry about the like long-term success and sustainability of that organization. So, we try and talk about like, what would it look like for you to bring on more help? Like, so sometimes just bringing on an owner's rep is like the door of like saying like, what do you see what it looks like when you have someone helping you with this, and how that could free up your time to be more impactful. And so starting to have those conversations, because, in the nonprofit space, this idea of like, if I bring on another salary, like that's a drain. It's like, well, if you bring on a salary that maybe they're activating and making more impact. And so with a revenue story, like how could you find money to pay for the next salary?
Well, we are at time, but the fact that we ended on pause, permission to pause, one of our colleagues that we love here at EDI, Patrice, she always says the phrase pause for the cause. So that was the perfect way to close this out. Did you want to add anything in, Giulia, before we wrap things up?
I was going to ask if there were any, like one or two sentence like reflection from the panelists, things that you're leaving with from this conversation.
I'll just say like one of the things we're thinking just a lot about is what does this work mean in this dynamic environment, and just trying to really walk alongside nonprofit leaders as they tackle so many challenges that they're facing with changes, particularly those that are heavily federally funded. And the real estate questions don't go away. Particularly for human service, direct service organizations, that like the need to gather and the need for more space just is persistent. So it's just a big moment as we continue to navigate this landscape.
So IFF's mission, we're a nonprofit, our mission is to serve nonprofits. And so one of the challenges we had to work through is like, we want to do this work in community, and there's both for-profit and nonprofit projects. And so we got ourselves comfortable with like the challenges that for-profit community development projects encounter are often the same as nonprofits. And so we're now comfortable with offering technical assistance to for-profit and nonprofit projects because of that. And for me, that was like, I've heard someone say like, sometimes making the problem bigger actually makes it easier to solve. This is a Center of Community Investment for some of you who know that. And I think that that's really interesting as I sit here today and we think about like how we make the umbrella bigger to include more people who are going through this, even if they're not doing exactly our sliver of the work, can actually be really powerful allies to help us think about how we are problem solving and bringing more resources to the table to do this work.
So, all right. Well, thank you both so much for being in conversation with us. Like I said, EDI, you know, as we're growing and evolving, we appreciate hearing from you and the opportunity to learn from you and share and make the umbrella bigger. We really appreciate that. So for other folks, we do have our second peer learning exchange, which will be on Thursday, September 18th at noon, and we're going to focus in on creating predictability and aligning funders and projects. So we hope you join us then. And then also just a shout out that EDI's RFP for funding is open right now for our 2025 fund. So if your organization is here in Seattle, take a look at that. And also, you know, as we move forward with doing more of these types of webinars and other types of learning opportunities, we know that there are great resources out there that both IFF and Community Vision have already created and put out there. And so we certainly, Jessica's been putting a lot of those in the chat. So please, we would love for folks to look at those. We're going to leverage those too. And then also, you know, with my experience of having about 10 years as, you know, an owner's rep for nonprofit organizations, I'm really hoping to put more together on the project readiness side as well for our grantees. So thanks again, everyone, and we will leave it there. We appreciate you both, Saul and Kate, and of course you too, Giulia and Jessica.
Thank you.
Have
Thanks,
a great day,
everybody.
everyone.
Thanks. Bye.